What is going on, all you wonderful A-plusers out there? It is I, Stuart, here once again to give you guys another review, but this time, for the first time on A-Plus Opinion, I'm going to be reviewing some comic books, which I've never done on this channel before, which is weird because we've been around for a while, and I've always been a fan of comic books, so it's kind of weird that it's taken me until now to finally do some comic book reviews. But what I really want to do is give my initial thoughts on Future State and what I think of it so far. Now, for those of you who don't know what Future State is, this is going to be kind of a long explanation. In order to explain what exactly Future State is, I'm going to have to take you guys to the very beginning, the birth of the DC multiverse, and kind of the birth of DC's pattern when it comes to rebooting itself a lot. Like, the joke kind of becomes, it feels like DC reboots itself every 5 years or so, and it's not quite to that extreme, although this last couple of times it really has been. We'll get right into that. So I guess you could say the first reboot of the DC universe kind of happened in 1959 with the release of the very first Flash issue. Now, this wasn't really meant to be a rebirth of the universe or anything like that. It was really just meant to be, oh, here's a new superhero that we're introducing. It's the Flash, but this time instead of Jay Garritt, it's now Barry Allen. This caused a lot of confusion amongst readers who have been around since the golden age of comic books. Essentially, the question kind of came in, wait a minute, but Jay Garrick's Flash crossed over with Superman, and Barry Allen's Flash also crosses over with Superman. So does this mean that there's a fictional Superman and a real Superman? I'm kind of confused here. And it was here that DC decided to have multiple Earths. It started out with a very simple premise like that. The Justice Society occupy Earth 2, whereas the Justice League occupy Earth 1. Simple, right? Well, then things got really confusing because this gave writers excuses to have all their what if type of comic books. Now, what if or Elseworlds wasn't actually a term at the time, but they did use a lot of multiverse type of storylines, and it led to a lot of confusions about what was canon and what wasn't canon to the overall DC universe. So in 1985, it was decided to give the whole universe a giant reboot with the comic book event known as Crisis on Infinite Earths. This was, of course, something that the CW did recently with their Arrowverse shows, because very similarly to the comic books, Arrowverse had a thing where not all of their shows were technically in the same universe, but they crossed over so much that why weren't they in the same universe? You had Supergirl occupying Earth 38, Black Lightning occupying Black Lightning's Earth. I don't think it's been specified what Earth he's on. But anyways, Crisis on Infinite Earths was kind of an excuse to merge all these different Earths, so now they're all together, and now they don't have to have an excuse for hopping dimensions. Now they're just all one big happy family. But the same thing happened in the Crisis on Infinite Earths comic book. Essentially, the comic book was made as an excuse to just erase the multiverse and have everything exist on one universe, so things could be simplified for everyone. Some characters that had very confusing rewritten backstories over and over, specifically Wonder Woman and Donna Troy, would now have a brand new official, this can no longer be changed backstory. This is their official backstory, right? Wrong. Unfortunately, so many writers at DC continue to have their own ideas of where they think their character should go, and I think that's kind of a problem DC has always had, is everyone has their own vision of Superman, their own vision of Batman, and their visions never tend to goddamn, what's the word I'm looking for? And their visions are never really coherent with each other. And so because of this, there were a couple of, I wouldn't call them reboots, but a bit of rewrites to the universe in order to tune a few things up. Now, this didn't rewrite the entire universe or anything like that. It would just change a few things that were a bit inconsistent. These events were known as 0 Hour, and then in 2004 we had Infinite Crisis, which, fun fact, that is the very first event comic book that I actually kept up with as it was coming out. And then of course there was Final Crisis. Eventually, with Infinite Crisis, we brought back the multiverse, but we still mostly focused on Earth 1 storylines, but that there would also be some occasional Elseworld storylines that would also coincide with it as well. It wasn't until 2011 where DC finally did a full-on reboot to the entire universe with the comic book storyline Flashpoint, and thus came New 52. Oh, New 52. One thing that a lot of people will never really admit about New 52 is that it kind of worked. For a small amount of time, that is. Not entirely. The very first year, I feel like, when New 52 came out, I feel like it was met with genuinely a really positive response by people. A lot of people were liking these new storylines, but there were a few things that were very confusing about the whole thing. Like, this was a reboot, but there were a lot of implications that some major storylines that happened in the previous universe were still canon with New 52, but it would never be fully explained what was canon and what wasn't canon, which again led to New 52 just being even more confusing. A lot of people didn't like some of the changes that were made to the universe, such as now instead of Wally West, we had a new character, Wally West, who a lot of people think was supposed to be the New 52 version of Wally West, but not only are they nothing alike, but essentially it does get confirmed in Rebirth that Wally West was definitely a separate character. And speaking of Rebirth, let's get into that, because Rebirth wasn't exactly a reboot to the series. It was more of a repolish of New 52. It didn't retcon New 52 at all. What it tried to do was merge New 52 with the old universe through the comic book Doomsday Clock. But unfortunately, due to so many delays with Doomsday Clock, there were so many other comic books that just wanted to move on and have their own explanations for why suddenly characters that didn't exist previously in New 52 now suddenly exist in New 52. And unfortunately, even though Rebirth started out, to my opinion, on an extremely high note, it really did go down a slippery slope, especially when it comes to the character of Wally West. But Rebirth did have a few really good runs going on for a while. Me personally, I was keeping up with Titans on a monthly basis. I tried to keep up with the Flash and with the Justice League comic books, but eventually I just kind of fell off after a little while, unfortunately. But I did keep up with Titans for a while, until a lot of changes happened that I wasn't really the biggest fan of. I feel like that's kind of been my biggest issue with Rebirth. A lot of changes happened to a lot of characters really fast, and when I heard about Future State and I heard this was supposed to be going on all at once, and it was supposed to be replacing all of what was going on currently with DC Rebirth, I thought once again they're just really rushing things, you know? Now, let's get into what Future State actually is. Future State is another reboot that comes after the events of DC Dark Metal. For those of you who did not read DC Dark Metal, essentially Wonder Woman is now a god and the universe has been rewritten once again. But the Future State DC comic books are a little weird because it's very different from what I thought they were going to be. Basically, when it came to the previous DC comic book reboots, usually you had New 52, all the comic books usually coincided around the same time. You always got to have this assumption with comic books, where if you see a Batman comic book where Batman's doing one thing, but then you see a Justice League comic book where Batman's doing a whole nother thing, you just got to kind of assume that one takes place after the other. And the reason he hasn't mentioned it yet is because the writers haven't decided which one really comes first. But essentially, they do happen around the same time. That's the kind of assumption you really have to make with yourself. But DC Future State is a little different. There are multiple timelines going on in DC Future State. Each one of the comic books I picked up felt like they were all like contradicting each other, and it wasn't until I read the actual kind of guidebook that they gave for DC Future State, and no, I'm not making that up. They literally have a book to guide you through what Future State really is and the timelines they have. It shows that these comic books are not taking place at the same time anymore, which leads to some interesting different changes to different characters based on what you're reading. Such as when I picked up the Flash comic book, I expected it to be about the Flash from the Justice League comic book series going on. But it turns out that no, it's about the Barry Allen Flash, essentially him in his own comic book. Same with the Batman comic book. I saw that it was a new guy named Tim Fox who was going to be Batman in Justice League, so I assumed that was going to be the same guy who was going to be Batman in his own solo adventures. Turns out, nope, it is actually Luke Fox who was Batman in the Batman comic books. Now, to be fair, all of these comic books have their own individual mini run, so I'm assuming there's going to be a giant tie-in to the Justice League comic book, kind of explaining where the characters are and how they got there eventually. And I say that because all these comic books have a very limited run. I believe Batman is like 2 or 4 issues, and then same with Superman, Wonder Woman, and the Flash. All of them have a very limited run, so I don't expect them to go on for that long. And I expect the only reason they're out there the way they are is to really give give you as the readers an idea of who these characters are and how they got there. Now that I've gone on this long tangent, it's time for me to actually review the comic books of DC Future State individually. So I'm gonna get my least favorite out of the way real quick, and that would be The Flash. To quote a very articulate comic book reviewer out there on the internet, "This comic sucks!" Yeah, I was not a fan of the DC Future State Flash comic book. I mentioned before about Wally West, and there's this theory or joke, I really don't know. I haven't really been keeping up with other comic book nerds as much as I really should be, but essentially people are saying that DC comic book writers hate Wally West, and I can totally see where they're coming from. You had this event going on a little while ago called Heroes in Crisis. The premise of the story was really good. I actually would go as far as to say I loved issues 1 through 6. Whoa, hear me out. I really just love the premise of it. The idea of there being a place where superheroes have to go in order to get some therapy. It was a great concept, but unfortunately the execution was terrible, especially because the whole story relied around this murder mystery that I thought had a lot of good buildup, and then the reveal was one of the worst reveals I've ever seen in comic book history. It was Wally West who killed a bunch of superheroes and villains, and he did it because he was upset and no one remembers him. It's one of those things where I don't necessarily mind superheroes turning to the dark side, but you gotta be good about it. Wally West breaking down because his life was taken away from him doesn't make sense for his character, especially since he's a character who's put his life on the line several times to save the universe. It's the exact same reason I hated the Savitar twist in the Flash TV show on the CW. It makes no sense for superheroes to turn to the dark side when something bad has happened to them specifically, and I don't mean the people around them, because here's the thing, Wally West didn't lose his wife. Well, he did lose his wife in the sense of he doesn't have her anymore, but she's not dead. She still exists in this universe. She's just living her own life, you know? And I understand that's something that's really hard to get past. Your own wife doesn't remember who you are. I can't imagine how that would feel for someone. But at the same time, when you're taking heroes that literally put their life on the line all the time, and you put them in a situation where they turn to the dark side the moment their life turns to crap, that doesn't make sense for their character. If really what they care about is their own life, then they wouldn't be putting their life on the line every day. Now, what does this have to do with the Flash comic book series, and why was I going on a tangent about something that wasn't even related to this? Well, because Wally West is the main villain of this Flash comic book. Yes, all the speedsters have lost their powers, and they must now try to stop the Wally West Flash using an arsenal of weapons from their rogues gallery. I want to start with what I like about that premise. First of all, I do like storylines that use superheroes losing their powers, because, you know, it's something that they've relied on for so long, and now we have to see them at their weakest. However, this is a reboot to the series, and this is how you're starting it off. Alright, imagine if the very first episode of The Flash started with The Flash losing its speed, and then he has to work on getting his speed back. That's not exactly a way you start off a franchise, at least not to my opinion. That was actually a really bad choice on their part, if I'm being honest. And then of course the other thing is, again, you're keeping Wally West as the main villain. Especially with the bad backlash that they got from Heroes in Crisis, it does seem very odd that DC would continue to go with this idea of Wally West being a villain. Keep in mind, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, Wally West was the one who took up the mantle of the Flash, and it wasn't one of those things where he was the Flash for a little bit and then Barry Allen came back. No, he was the Flash right up until I want to say like 2008 or 2009 when Jeff Johns brought him back with the Flash Rebirth comic book series. But before that, he was the Flash for the longest time. When watching the Justice League cartoon series, he was the Flash used in that series. In fact, I believe one of the writers of that show even straight up confirmed that Barry Allen doesn't even exist in the DC animated universe. It was always Wally West as the Flash. It felt kind of like a stab in the back from the writers. There's also the whole thing where Barry doesn't want to give up on Wally West, and it costs him a lot. I don't want to give too much away with the comic book, but essentially he ends up paying the price for believing in Wally West, almost as if to tell the audience reading reading this, yeah, if you really thought Wally West was still the Flash, guess what? Here you go, guys. He's not the Flash anymore. But yeah, I was not a fan of the Flash comic book at all. Moving on to Batman. Gonna put that in frame real quick. The Batman comic book that was released. Now, this one was a double feature comic book, but I'm only really going to be talking about the Batman side of things. I thought it was good for the most part. I really enjoyed the story. I really like Luke Fox as a character regardless, and also the whole idea of masks now being completely illegal in Gotham City, which, I mean, I'm sure that's been established in Gotham City before, but it's Gotham City, so who actually follows the law in Gotham City? But with that all being said, the story was not bad, and I do like the way they introduced Tim Fox into the story. Apparently, he and Luke Fox do not have a really good relationship, but we also know that Luke Fox is currently Batman. So we know that whatever happens between the two of them, eventually Luke Fox, whether or not it's that he dies and his brother takes over or he gives the costume to him, we know that eventually Tim Fox is going to become the new Batman. So it is kind of an interesting way to start out a story with us kind of knowing what the result is going to be, but not knowing how it's going to get there. So it was a lot of really cool concepts. I also did love the whole thing where you had essentially a gang of Banes. It was kind of similar to the Joker gang from Batman Beyond, but instead of the Joker, it's Bane, and it's essentially a bunch of gang members picking up street kids, trying to convince them to join them, essentially giving them the idea of, if you join us, you will never be alone, much like how a lot of gangs and cults in general just tend to work. You know, you never really select people that have, you know, a lot going for them. You always go after the people who have nothing in their life, and you know that you can manipulate them, and that's what the gangs, the Bane gang, I forgot if they actually have a name or not, but you know, that's essentially what they do in this comic book, and I think it works really well. This is a really good comic so far, and I really am intrigued to see where it goes. Superman of Metropolis, I wasn't the biggest fan of. They really want you to know that Connor Kent is not his dad at all. He's his own new Superman. So they have him do a weird decision that I don't really want to spoil for you guys yet. But it definitely is something that I thought went a little bit too far for a Superman character to kind of do, especially because whether or not it is Clark Kent, it's still Clark Kent's son, you know, someone who Clark Kent has taught all his moral values to. And everything that we've seen of Jonathan Kent since he was like a little kid, there's nothing to really imply that he wouldn't want to follow in his father's footsteps. But maybe that's kind of the point, is that he's afraid he can't follow in his father's footsteps, so he takes things to a new extreme, feeling that he'd be a failure regardless. But I feel like this comic book storyline would have worked a lot better if we had Connor Kent as Superman instead of Jonathan Kent. This definitely felt more like a Connor Kent type of storyline. We'd also had a cool fight scene between Superman and Supergirl, because of course this decision that Jonathan Kent makes wasn't exactly morally the right decision per se, but it did lead to a cool fight, so it had that going for it. But I just thought the comic book overall was okay. Not bad, but it was okay. The last of the solo comic books I'm going to be talking about is Wonder Woman, and again, I'm decently mixed on this comic book. One thing I do want to point out real quick is that I do almost really like the new Wonder Woman character, and I say almost because I don't think she should be called Wonder Woman. She doesn't act like an adult in this comic book. I feel like this comic had to have been written with the idea in mind of her being Wonder Girl, because she doesn't act like an adult. She acts like a teenager the entire time. She's super irrational about a lot of her decisions, and essentially is very much a punch first, ask questions later type of a character. And normally I wouldn't mind that for an adult character if it was an anti-hero, but they're really implying that she is a superhero, but she has just such a weird, impatient mindset. She reminds me in a lot of ways of Korra from Legend of Korra, and I think that would have worked a lot better if she was a younger character. But knowing that this is now Wonder Woman, I don't know why they didn't go with Donna Troy or Cassie. I always forget Cassie's last name. The Wonder Girl from Young Justice, though, not the Wonder Girl from the Teen Titans, although the Wonder Girl from Young Justice did eventually become a Teen Titan. Whew. Anyways, I feel like maybe one of them should have been given the title of Wonder Woman, and then we could have given Yara the title of Wonder Girl if they were going to write her this way. But with that being said, the comic book was really fun. I did love their depiction of Hades being an airport, because we have a character who's so impatient and always just wants to get to the point. So what would her hell be? It would of course be an airport. The one place where no matter what kind of a person you are, you always have to be patient. The airport, the one place that everyone hates to be, the airport. To me, that was just hilarious. I kind of like that whole concept. So it was all right storyline altogether. Not my favorite. And again, if you're going to write a character like this, you should really go with a Wonder Girl or a teenage character in general. It doesn't even have to be Wonder Girl. It could be like literally any character as a teenager. But essentially, yeah, this type of a character just doesn't really make sense to be written as an adult, to my opinion anyways. That all being said, I got one more comic book to review for you guys, but I do not actually own a physical copy of it, but that is Justice League. And Justice League takes place at kind of the end of all of the timelines that we've seen so far. So all the comic books that I've reviewed all take place in their own different timeline, but they all do supposedly lead up to the future state of Justice League. And I did think the future state Justice League was decent overall. The main villains of this comic book are the White Martians, and the White Martians in this comic book take on the forms of the Justice League themselves. I also like how we don't fully know the identity of all the different League members that we got. For the Flash in particular, they're constantly referring to the Flash as they and them, so we're not sure if that's just how the new Flash identifies themselves, or if it's actually a little more literal than we mean. Like maybe this version of the Flash is literally a combination of all the Flashes fused into one, which would be kind of an interesting concept. We know that speedsters have an ability to steal each other's speed, so I'm wondering if that's something that they could go with, which is like an idea of instead of stealing each other's speed, like they literally fuse each other's speeds physically, becoming one person. That's my guess of where they could be going with that storyline, but we'll have to wait and find out for that. But guys, overall, my overall thoughts on DC Future State so far, very mixed, and that worries me because New 52 had a thing where it started out strong and then it kind of went downhill. DC Rebirth had a thing where it started out really strong and then just kind of slowly, but then eventually just plop, went right downhill again. And with this comic book series not starting out as strong as either of them, I'm wondering if it's going to start out low and then just get lower and lower, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's starting out low is a good thing. Maybe there's nowhere else it can go but up. Except for, I wouldn't say it's not that low. Like, only the Flash comic book was really a bad comic book. I did find aspects of the other comics I read in Future State that I thought were decent, not amazing, but I didn't mind them. So I do think there is definitely potential for this universe to kind of find its footing and eventually, probably go back up. But again, it really all just kind of depends on what the DC writers decide to do with it, because I feel like this is all just one experiment after another. They really want to wait till they get the fan feedback, and then they're going to probably implement some elements from Future State back into, regular DC universe, and we're going to see like a weird combination of the two, but I'm not 100% sure. But anyways, I do think overall I'm kind of mixed on DC Future State. I really wish I loved it more than I currently do, but unfortunately it's just, as of now, it's just okay. But guys, you know what? At the end of the day, these are just my A+ opinions. I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say, so definitely let me know in the comments below. Do you guys love this new direction that DC has taken, or does it really bother you even more than it bothers me? I definitely want to hear about it. Definitely hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, but remember guys, above all, to keep it A+.